We had decided to take a 20-minute hike in Noping called Walking in the Ancient Mountains, which basically consisted of a climb to a huge rock that took you above the tree canopy, offering you a 360-degree view of the surrounding lakes and forests. There were a few picnic tables at the top for breakfast, and it was a magnificent spot to watch the sunrise. My boyfriend and I drove there, losing signal on the way, with the last thing we saw being a campsite about 22 kilometers down a gravel road before reaching our destination. We were quite isolated. We arrived at around 1 a.m., and since we had a bed in the back of our SUV, we could take a nap before starting the hike. We parked at the trailhead and got ready to sleep. We honked the horn, slammed the doors, and shouted to scare off any nearby animals like bears before walking about 40 feet to the restroom. After all that, we got into bed, locked the doors, and the next moment, we heard heavy footsteps on the gravel outside the car. Step, step, drag, step, step, drag. Paralyzed with fear for a moment, listening as the footsteps approached the car, I quickly crawled to the front seat, started the car, and pointed the lights around to see what was outside. But there was nothing. No footprints in the gravel. No signs of anything having been there. I took a quick drive around with the lights shining brightly into the surrounding bushes and saw nothing. Still terrified, I stayed awake for almost an hour, shining the lights and waiting for something to emerge. After not seeing anything, I assumed whatever it was had left and wouldn't come back. So, I turned off the lights and crawled back into the bed where my boyfriend was sleeping. No sooner had I laid my head down than we heard the footsteps again, this time walking from the rear wheel on the driver's side where my head was, around the trunk, to the wheel on my boyfriend's side. We looked out the windows, too scared to move, but saw nothing. Then suddenly there was a loud, slow scratching on the wheel next to my boyfriend's head. He banged on the car wall to scare it off, but it stayed nearby. After all this, I don't remember why we stayed and didn't just leave. Maybe at that moment we thought it was over since it was more than a 3-hour drive from Winnipeg to get there, and you'd hate to have wasted all that time. Anyway, we stayed. The footsteps and scratches continued almost all night, and once it started to get light enough to see our surroundings better, the sound stopped. We put on our headlamps and began our hike. It was too dark to see anything when we left. But once we returned from our breakfast at dawn on top of the rock, we saw that the tire where we had heard the scratches was flat. There was no explanation why. We changed it and headed home. But to this day, when I think about it, there's no animal I know of that behaves that way, with those heavy, specific footsteps that seemed like someone dragging something, maybe a body. I'm not a big believer in ghosts, but I've considered it as an option. Perhaps this large rock that juts out above the tree canopy was significant for indigenous peoples at some point. I can't be sure, but has anyone else had similar experiences in the wilds of Manitoba? In my hometown, there's a huge lake, a large and desolate place ideal for camping, fishing, and hunting. To give you some context, I live in Norway, where we have something called the right of access, which basically means you can roam freely anywhere in the country as long as it's not private property. Because of this, Norwegians love to explore nature, and with plenty of space for everyone, people generally don't crowd together. My friend and I were planning a camping trip. We were going to go up the river by boat and head to an island in the middle of the lake. When we got there, we found an ideal spot, probably previously used by other campers. Something that unsettled me a bit was a northern pike head hanging from a tree next to a campfire. It was huge and stared at the campsite with its dead, dry eyes. The real event happened after nightfall. We had been sitting around the campfire for hours, eating, drinking, and chatting. This was in summer, and summers in Norway aren't very dark due to the geographic location, but around 2 a.m., it was quite dark. However, I noticed something in the lake. I couldn't make out what it was and didn't really care. After a while, we went to our tents and slept. That night, I had some very strange dreams. I saw the pike move its eyes, making sounds. The sky changed colors. I saw a man in the lake, the water evaporating and condensing again. The pike said something to the river, and suddenly I woke up. I was sweating. I checked my phone. It was still night. I was only 14. My brain not fully developed and underage drinking certainly didn't help, but I was scared. I had no idea why. It was the kind of fear where you just don't want to see anything. I didn't want to open the tent. I stayed completely still and pretended to be asleep. I heard noises, sounds from the dream, noises that the head in the tree had made. I stayed rigid, feeling the blood pumping through my body. Then I heard people screaming. The noises were no more than 100 meters away, and it was more than 100 meters to the mainland. The island we were on was small. You could probably walk around it in 5 minutes. The human voices continued. They were laughing and shouting. The laughter affected me the most. It was an ugly laugh, not the kind that sounds like people are having fun. At some point, I felt like someone was approaching our campsite. I got scared and stayed completely still. Eventually, exhaustion must have taken over, and I fell asleep again. I woke up early in the morning. My friend was already awake. I asked him if he had heard the noise, but he said no. I wondered if it had all been a dream. Then I saw something in the lake. A man was standing there on some sort of rudimentary raft, about 200 meters away from us, looking in our direction. I couldn't make out any facial features. He looked pale. My heart started beating faster. The man stayed there for a long time. We got so uneasy that we finally packed our things and went home. Luckily, we had a motorboat so he could never catch up to us. I still remember the way he looked at us as we left the lake and headed for the river. He just stayed there. Later, I realized what I had seen in the lake in the darkness the previous night was probably him. He had been standing there the whole time. He was responsible for the sounds I heard. He knew we were alone on the small island, which wasn't really a place where drunk teenagers would go on spontaneous trips in the middle of the night. He put the fish head in the tree to scare people away. We had stepped on his territory or something. And perhaps most importantly, why was he standing there on a raft in the lake? Did he step onto the island while we were sleeping and plan to do something to us? And who was he shouting or laughing with? I have no answers to any of these questions, and I haven't gone back there since. Both my friend and I get a little nervous every time someone mentions the man on the raft.